The archaeologists didn't expect to find them. It was 1958. The communist government had finally granted permission to open the tomb of Emperor Yongle, sealed for over 500 years beneath the Forbidden City. The team descended into darkness with flashlights and cameras expecting jade artifacts and imperial treasures. What they found instead were bodies, 16 skeletons, all female, all arranged in seated positions around the main burial chamber as if waiting, as if they had been placed there to serve someone, even in death. The forensic analysis came back 3 weeks later. Ages ranged from 14 to 28. All had died in the same year, 1424. 13 showed clean cervical trauma evidence of hanging, but 3 skeletons told a different story. Broken fingers, scratch marks on the surrounding stone walls, fractured arm bones consistent with desperate clawing. The lad archaeologist wrote in his report, "These 3 were buried alive, and they tried to escape." This wasn't a burial. This was a crime scene 534 years old. And the woman in Chamber 7 had a name, though it took historians another decade to find it in Korean diplomatic archives, written in a language the Ming court couldn't censor. Her name was Han. She was 16 years old when they took her from her village in Joseon. She was 19 when they buried her alive in white silk. This is her story. But more than that, this is the story of a system, a machine designed to harvest human beings and erase them from history. Let's go back to where it started. 1421. The geopolitics were simple. The Ming dynasty had spent decades expanding its influence across Asia. Korea, then called Joseon, was a vassal state, and vassal states paid tribute: gold, silk, porcelain, rice. These were expected. But there was another form of payment, one that didn't appear in official trade records: people. Between 1408 and 1435, the Ming court received over 100 Korean women as what they called diplomatic gifts. The official term was tribute women, a cleaner phrase for what was essentially state-sanctioned human trafficking. The system worked like this. Every 3 years, Ming officials traveled through the Korean provinces, conducting what they called the Shunu selection. It sounded elegant, refined, like an audition for a prestigious academy. It was nothing of the sort. It was a forced harvest. Provincial quotas were set by imperial decree. Every region had to provide a certain number of unmarried girls between the ages of 13 and 18. No family was exempt. Hiding a daughter was considered treason, punishable by death for the entire household. The selection process was clinical. Physicians examined the girls like livestock, checking teeth, skin, hair. They looked for birthmarks, scars, any physical imperfection. Those who passed the inspection were taken. The families received what the court called compensation, usually a small sum of money and a certificate stating their daughter had been chosen to serve the Son of Heaven. Refusing the money meant admitting you opposed the emperor, and opposing the emperor meant execution. Most families took the money. What choice did they have? One less daughter to feed, one less mouth in times of famine. They signed the documents often with ink marks instead of names because most couldn't write. Then they watched as their daughters were loaded into sealed carriages and driven away. Many families held funerals for daughters who were still alive because they understood something the girls didn't yet know. The daughter they had raised was already gone. Han's village received the imperial notice in the winter of 1420. She was 15 then, living in a small fishing community on the southern coast. Her father caught mackerel. Her mother dyed cloth with indigo. They had 3 children. Han was the eldest. She helped her mother with the dyeing, her hands permanently stained blue from the work. There was a boy in the village, a potter's apprentice named Kim Jin-woo. He had smiled at her twice at the market. She had smiled back. In another life, in another world, maybe they would have married. Maybe she would have had children and grown old dyeing cloth beside her mother. But the imperial officials arrived in March of 1421. They set up tables in the village square and called every family with unmarried daughters. Han's father tried to hide her. He told the officials she was already engaged, already promised to another family. They asked for proof. He had none. The physician examined Han in front of the entire village. He checked her teeth like a horse buyer at market. He examined her hands, her neck, her hair. She passed every test. The official handed Han's mother a document and a small purse of coins. Her mother couldn't read, so she pressed her thumb into red ink and marked the paper. Then she held Han and sobbed. Han's little brother, only 7 years old, didn't understand why everyone was crying. He thought his sister was going to the palace to become a princess. Han tried to tell him the truth, but she didn't know it yet herself. 3 days later, 16 girls from the region were loaded into covered carriages. The carriages had no windows. The girls were forbidden to speak to each other. Guards rode alongside, armed and silent. Han sat in the darkness beside a girl named Su Jin, who was only 14. They couldn't talk, but sometimes in the night when the carriage stopped and the guards were distracted, Su Jin would reach out and squeeze Han's hand. That small gesture, that brief moment of human contact, was the only comfort either of them had. The journey took 3 weeks. They traveled north through mountain passes and across rivers, always in the sealed carriages, always in darkness. The food was minimal. Rice balls and water handed through a slot in the carriage door. They slept on wooden benches. The cold seeped through the thin blankets they'd been given. On the 5th night, one of the girls tried to escape. Her name was never recorded. She was 17, and according to the whispers Han heard later, she had been pregnant when they took her. She waited until the guards were changing shifts, then bolted from the carriage and ran into the woods. They caught her within an hour. The guards dragged her back and made an example of her. They crushed her right hand with a mallet, breaking every bone, while the other girls watched from inside the carriages. The girl screamed for her mother. She screamed until her voice gave out. 3 days later, she died of infection. The guards left her body at the side of the road. No burial, no marker. Just a corpse dumped like garbage. The other 15 girls learned the lesson. Resistance was not an option. When the carriages finally stopped, Han heard a sound she'd never forget. The grinding of massive gates closing. She didn't know it yet, but those were the gates of the Forbidden City. And once they closed behind her, there would be no leaving. Not ever. The girls were led out of the carriages into blinding sunlight. Han's eyes, adjusted to weeks of darkness, couldn't process what she was seeing at first. Red walls that stretched higher than any building in her village. Golden roofs that glinted like fire. Courtyards so vast they seemed to have no end. A eunuch in silk robes stood before them with a scroll. He didn't look at their faces as he read. He called them by numbers, not names. Joseon tribute 1 through 15. Han was number 7. They were taken to a bathhouse first. Female attendants stripped them naked and scrubbed them with brushes so rough they left Han's skin raw and bleeding. Then they cut her hair short, right at the jawline. In Korean culture, cutting a woman's hair was a mark of deep shame. Han watched her black hair fall to the wet stone floor and felt something inside her break. The attendants burned all their clothes, the garments they'd brought from home. Han's mother had sewn her dress herself, using the good fabric they saved for festivals. Han watched it go up in flames and said nothing. She had learned not to cry, but when they took the small embroidered pouch from around her neck, the one her mother had given her that contained a lock of her mother's hair, Han couldn't stay silent. She reached for it, pleading in Korean. The eunuch slapped her hand away and threw the pouch into the fire. That was when Han started screaming. She lunged for the flames, trying to retrieve it. 3 eunuchs grabbed her and held her down. One of them hit her across the back with a bamboo rod. Once, twice, 3 times. The pain was stunning, sharp enough to drive the breath from her lungs. When they finally let her go, Han collapsed on the wet floor and watched the last piece of her mother turn to ash. And something in her mind went very quiet. A part of her that had been Han, daughter of the Park family fisherman's child, Indigo Dyer's apprentice, that part began to die. What remained was Joseon tribute number 7. The girls were taken to a dormitory in the far eastern section of the Forbidden City. 20 beds in a single room. Thin mattresses on wooden frames. They were given gray robes to wear. No shoes. The floor was cold stone. An older woman entered the room. She was Chinese, perhaps in her late 20s, with a face that showed no expression at all. She introduced herself only as Lady Kwai, a concubine of the 5th rank. She had been in the Forbidden City for 12 years. Lady Kwai spoke slowly, choosing her words with care. She told the girls they were entering what the palace called the refinement process. It would last between 6 months and 2 years, depending on how quickly they adapted. She used that word, adapted, as if they were plants being transferred to new soil. Then she gave them 3 rules. Never mention your family, never speak of your home, never hope for anything. Her voice was flat, mechanical, like she was reading from a script she'd memorized years ago. But when she looked at Hans, something flickered in her eyes. Not quite pity, more like recognition. The look of someone seeing their past self. That night, Sujin whispered to Han in the darkness. She asked if Han thought they would ever go home. Han wanted to say yes. She wanted to comfort the younger girl. But she remembered the corpse on the roadside, the crushed hand, the screaming. She remembered her hair burning. She remembered Lady Kui's dead eyes, so Han said nothing. And Sujin cried herself to sleep. The refinement process began the next morning at 4. A gong woke them. They had 15 minutes to dress and assemble in the courtyard. Any girl who was late was struck with a bamboo rod. They learned quickly. The first phase was identity erasure. For 2 months, the girls were forbidden to use their names. They were only numbers. Joseon Tribute 7, Joseon Tribute 12. If a girl spoke her own name, she was punished. If she mentioned her mother or father, she was punished. If she was caught keeping any personal item from home, she was punished. Sujin made that mistake. She had hidden a small letter her mother had written tucked into the waistband of her undergarments. Someone informed on her. Han never found out who. The eunuchs discovered the letter during a surprise inspection. They made Sujin strip naked in front of everyone. Then they beat her with bamboo rods, 50 strikes across her back and legs. Sujin didn't scream. She bit down on a cloth they'd given her and endured it in silence. But afterwards, she couldn't walk for a week. And then Sujin disappeared. One morning, her bed was empty. Lady Kui said she'd been transferred to another dormitory. But Han never saw her again. None of them did. That was when Han learned the second lesson. Silence wasn't just safety. Silence was survival. The second phase was submission training. The girls spent 8 hours a day learning how to bow. There were 15 different types of bows, each with a specific meaning. A bow for the emperor, a bow for the empress, a bow for higher-ranking concubines, a bow for imperial princes. Each bow had to be performed exactly right, the angle of the back, the position of the hands, the lowering of the eyes. If a bow was imperfect, they were struck on the legs with bamboo. By the end of the first month, every girl had permanent bruises on her shins and calves. Some developed infections. One girl's legs swelled so badly she couldn't stand. She too disappeared one night. They learned to walk without making sound, to keep their eyes lowered at all times, to speak only when directly addressed and then in voices barely above a whisper, to move through space as if they weren't there. They were being taught to become invisible. The third phase was called preparation, though the eunuchs never explained what they were being prepared for. Once a month, imperial physicians examined the girls. The examinations were thorough and humiliating. The physicians recorded everything in ledgers, clinical notes, written with the same detached language one might use to describe the breeding of horses. Palace archives from 1423 contain entries like this. Candidate 17 shows continued resistance during preparation protocols. Additional treatments required. 3 sessions completed. Compliance improving. The physicians never used the girls' names. Just numbers. Just data points. Han learned to separate her mind from her body during these examinations. She would close her eyes and imagine she was back in her village, her hands in the indigo dye, the smell of the ocean, her mother's voice singing. She would go so deep into that fantasy that sometimes she forgot where she was. When she opened her eyes and saw the stone ceiling of the examination room, it felt like waking from a dream into a nightmare. Or maybe it was the other way around. After 6 months, 12 girls remained from the original 16. 4 had died or disappeared. The 12 survivors were deemed ready to enter the official concubine system. They were assigned ranks based on age and appearance. Han at 16 was given the rank of 7, the third lowest tier. Lady Kui came to see her the night before Han's official entry into the harem. She brought tea and sat with Han in silence for a long time. Finally, she spoke. "I was like you once," Kui said. "I came here when I was 15. That was 12 years ago. I thought if I was obedient, if I was perfect, I might earn favor and rise in rank. I thought I might have some small measure of control over my life." She paused, staring at the tea. "I was wrong. There is no control here. There is only survival. Do you understand?" Han nodded. She understood. "Then survive," Kui said. "However you can, whatever it takes, just to survive." It was the closest thing to kindness Han had experienced in 6 months. She held on to it. The next morning, Han was led to her new quarters. She would share a small room, perhaps 6 square meters, with 3 other 7th-rank concubines. The room had 4 wooden sleeping platforms, a single small table, and a window that looked out onto a brick wall. This was where she would live. For how long, no one would say. Maybe years, maybe decades, maybe until she died. A eunuch handed her a set of pale blue robes, the color designated for her rank. He explained the hierarchy. The empress wore gold. Imperial consorts wore red. High-ranking concubines wore crimson or deep purple. Mid-rank wore pink or light purple. Low rank, like Han, wore blue or gray. The color of your robe determined everything. How much food you received, how many servants you could request, the size of your living quarters, whether you were allowed to walk in certain gardens, even the material of the dishes you ate from. The empress received over 10 kilograms of premium meat every day, along with fresh fruits, imported delicacies, wine. She had 20 personal servants, musicians, cooks. Han, as a seventh-rank concubine, received about 2 kilograms of meat per day. Except the eunuchs who managed food distribution were notoriously corrupt. They skimmed from the lower ranks portions and sold the extra on the black market. By the time Han's food reached her, it was often closer to 1 kilogram. Rice and vegetables, occasionally some pork or chicken, never enough. Within 3 months, Han lost weight. Her cheekbones became sharp. Her hair, which had finally grown back, became thin and brittle. She was always hungry, always cold, always exhausted, but she was alive. And in the Forbidden City, that counted as success. The harem contained over 200 women when Han arrived in late 1421. One empress, 4 imperial consorts, about 30 high and mid-rank concubines, and over 150 common concubines like Han, all competing for the attention of one man. Emperor Yongle, he was 61 years old in 1421. He had ruled for 19 years. He was considered one of the great Ming emperors, a military leader who had expanded the empire's borders, a patron of architecture, who had commissioned the Forbidden City itself. History would remember him as Yongle the Great. History would not remember the 2,800 women he had executed in a single night. But we're not there yet. The selection ritual happened every evening. At 8 o'clock, the emperor would retire to his chambers. A chief eunuch would present him with wooden tablets, each bearing the name and a small painted portrait of an available concubine. The emperor would point to 1 or 2 tablets. That was the selection. The chosen woman would be immediately summoned. She had 15 minutes to reach the bathing palace where female attendants would prepare her. They would bathe her, arrange her hair, perfume her skin, but they would not dress her. Instead, they would wrap her naked body in a red silk blanket like a package. Only her face would be visible. The reason for this was coldly practical. A clothed woman could hide a weapon. A naked woman could not. 2 eunuchs would then carry the wrapped concubine to the emperor's chambers. They would unroll the blanket at the foot of the imperial bed. The woman would have to crawl without clothing toward the emperor. She was not permitted to lift her eyes. And here was the detail most people never knew. A chief eunuch remained in the room throughout the entire encounter. He stood behind a silk screen, invisible but present. His job was to keep time. After exactly 30 minutes, the eunuch would call out in a loud voice, "Time to preserve the golden essence of the Son of Heaven." The emperor had to finish immediately. If he didn't, the eunuch would enter the room and physically remove the concubine. No exceptions. After the encounter, the woman was examined by an imperial physician who recorded every detail. The date, the time, the duration, physical observations, all of it went into official records. Why? Because if she became pregnant, there needed to be absolute proof that the child belonged to the emperor. But here was the cruelest mathematics of the system. There were over 200 women in the harem. The emperor summoned perhaps 1 or 2 per week. Sometimes he went weeks without summoning anyone. Do the calculation. A woman in Han's position had maybe a 0.5% chance of being selected in any given week. Most concubines were never summoned. Not once, not ever. They would spend their entire lives, sometimes decades, waiting for a call that would never come, aging in silence, watching younger girls arrive, knowing that their only purpose, the only reason they had been taken from their families, would never be fulfilled. And yet, they couldn't leave, couldn't marry, couldn't have children with anyone else. They were property. Property in permanent storage. Han was summoned for the first time 4 months after entering the harem. She was 16 years old. When the eunuch called her number, her heart stopped. Around her, the other women stared with mixtures of envy and relief. Envy because she had been chosen. relief because they had been spared. Han was taken to the bathing palace. The attendants worked quickly, efficiently. They scrubbed her skin until it was red. They arranged her hair in an elaborate style she'd never seen before. They applied perfume to her wrists and neck, and then they wrapped her in red silk and carried her away. She remembered very little of what happened next. Her mind did what it had learned to do during the physician's examinations. It went somewhere else. She thought about her mother. She thought about indigo dye and fishing boats and Kim Jin-woo's smile. She thought about anything except where she was and what was happening. The chief eunuch called time. The attendants returned, rewrapped her in the silk, and carried her back to the examination room. The physician checked her and recorded his notes. Then they took her back to her quarters. Lady Kui was waiting there. She had somehow known. She held Han while Han shook silently. She didn't cry. She had forgotten how. "The first time is the hardest," Kui whispered. "After the 100th time, you don't feel it anymore." Han looked at her. "Is that supposed to comfort me?" Kui's expression didn't change. "No, it's supposed to prepare you for what comes next." What came next was the invisible war. The harem wasn't just a prison, it was an arena. Hundreds of women all competing for the favor of one man, all knowing that a single pregnancy could change everything, or destroy everything. The result was a hidden war that operated beneath the surface of daily life. A war fought with poison rumors and calculated cruelty. Concubine Yang was a third-rank consort, 24 years old, beautiful and sharp-minded. She had given the emperor one son, now 2 years old. That son made her untouchable, or so she thought. Concubine Mei was fourth-rank, 30 years old. She had been a favorite 5 years ago, but the emperor's interest had waned. She had no children. Her position was precarious. She was growing desperate. Concubine Zhou was 6th-rank, 22, an ally of Mei. She was known for causing trouble for newer concubines, testing them, looking for weaknesses. Within Han's first month in the harem, her food began smelling strange. She couldn't identify what was wrong, but something about the rice made her uneasy. She didn't eat it. Instead, she gave it to a stray dog that sometimes wandered near the kitchens. The dog died 2 hours later, convulsing and foaming at the mouth. Han reported it to Lady Kui. Kui investigated quietly and discovered that Zhou had bribed a kitchen eunuch to add a slow-acting poison to Han's meals. Not enough to kill quickly, just enough to make her sick, to ruin her appearance, to ensure the emperor never selected her again. Kui reported it to the empress. Zhou's food rations were cut by 50% for 6 months. But she wasn't expelled. She wasn't even demoted. The system protected itself. Poisoning a rival wasn't a crime. It was competition. 3 months later, Consort Yang announced she was pregnant again, her second child. If it was another boy, her status would be secured for life. Consort Mei couldn't allow that. She convinced a servant to slip abortifacient herbs into Yang's tea. Yang miscarried in her 5th month. The baby was a boy. An investigation was launched. Servants were tortured. But Mei had been careful. There was no direct evidence. Her loyal servant, a woman who had served Mei for 8 years, confessed to acting alone. The servant was executed. Mei was demoted from 4th rank to 6th, but she survived. Yang fell into a depression after losing the child. She stopped eating. Within a year, she was no longer summoned. Her beauty faded. Her son was taken from her and raised by wet nurses. She spent the rest of her life, another 23 years, in a small room in the Eastern Palace. She died at 47 alone. Han watched all of this happen. She learned the rules of the invisible war. Trust no one. Form temporary alliances. Never get pregnant unless you wanted to become a target. Never appear too beautiful or too favored. Become unremarkable. Become invisible. She and Lady Kui formed an alliance with 2 other 7th-rank concubines. They shared information. They watched each other's food. They warned each other about dangerous women to avoid. And Han made a decision that probably saved her life. She began taking contraceptive herbs purchased secretly from a palace herbalist at great cost. She would rather never rise in rank than risk pregnancy in this place. Kui told her that 70% of the lower-rank concubines did the same. They had all done the math. They had all watched what happened to women who got pregnant. Better to remain invisible than to become a target. Han lived this way for 3 years. She was summoned twice more during that time. Both encounters were mechanical, brief, forgettable. She learned to endure them the way she had learned to endure everything else, by going somewhere else in her mind. She was 19 years old in early 1421. She had been in the Forbidden City for 3 years. She no longer remembered what her father's face looked like. She could barely remember her village. Sometimes she tried to recall her mother's voice and couldn't. That frightened her more than anything else. The thought that she was forgetting who she had been. That Han, the girl from the fishing village, was disappearing. And in her place was just a number, just a ghost. But she was surviving. By Lady Kui's standards, that made her successful. Then the rumor started. It began as whispers in the bathing houses passed between servants and lower-ranked concubines. One of the emperor's favorites, Consort Lu, had been found dead in her chambers. The official announcement said she had been poisoned by a rival, but the rumor said something different. The rumor said Lu had killed herself, and the reason was a scandal that threatened the very foundation of imperial power. They said Lu had been having an affair with a palace eunuch. They said the emperor had discovered it. And worse, they said the affair had started because the emperor himself was impotent, unable to perform his duties, and Lu had sought comfort elsewhere. In any other context, this would have been palace gossip. Scandalous, but ultimately meaningless. But this was different. The emperor's virility wasn't just personal, it was political. The emperor's ability to produce heirs was tied directly to the mandate of heaven, the divine right to rule. If the emperor was impotent, it could be interpreted as a sign that heaven had withdrawn its favor. Court factions could use that as justification for rebellion. Military commanders could use it to challenge succession. For a 61-year-old emperor with a weak son and numerous enemies, this rumor was an existential threat. Emperor Yongle didn't handle it well. For a week, he didn't appear in public. No imperial audiences, no summons for concubines. The palace fell into an eerie quiet. Even the eunuchs, usually chattering and gossiping, went silent. Lady Kui came to Han's room one night. Her face was pale. "Something is happening," she said. "I don't know what, but something is very wrong." Han asked what she meant. Kui shook her head. "Just be careful. Don't go anywhere alone. Don't speak to anyone you don't trust. And if the guards come, don't resist." Han wanted to ask more, but Kui was already gone. That night, Han had a dream. She was standing in the courtyard of the Forbidden City, but the stones beneath her feet were wet. When she looked down, she saw the wetness was blood. It was everywhere, pooling in the corners, running in rivers between the buildings. She tried to run, but her feet slipped in it. She fell, and the blood covered her face, filled her mouth. She woke gasping. It was still dark. The other women in her room were asleep. Han lay awake until dawn, unable to shake the image from her mind. The next day, everything changed. The morning of the purge began like any other. The gong sounded at 4. Han and the other concubines dressed and assembled for morning prayers. They bowed to portraits of the emperor and empress. They recited the ritual phrases, thanking heaven for their place in the palace. It was all routine, mechanical. No one sensed what was coming. At noon, guards appeared at every gate of the harem. The gates were locked. No one was permitted to enter or leave. An announcement was made. All women were to remain in their quarters until further notice. At first, the concubines thought it was a standard security protocol, maybe a visiting foreign dignitary, maybe an imperial inspection. These things happened occasionally, but as the hours passed and no explanation came, unease began to spread. The guards at the gates were not the usual palace guards. These were imperial soldiers armed with swords and crossbows. Their faces were hard, expressionless. At 3 in the afternoon, eunuchs began moving through the dormitories with scrolls. They were reading names, not ranks. Names. When a name was called, the woman had to stand and follow. No questions, no explanations. In Han's dormitory, they called 2 names. Both were low-rank concubines Han barely knew. The women stood. They looked terrified. They asked where they were being taken. The eunuchs said nothing. The guards escorted them out. Han heard names being called in other dormitories. The sounds carried through the courtyards. Women crying, women pleading, doors slamming, boots on stone. By 5 in the evening, over 2,000 women had been taken from their quarters and assembled in the main courtyards of the harem. The courtyards were enormous, but even so they were packed. Women stood shoulder to shoulder, pressed together, some crying, some silent, all afraid. Han was not among them. Her name had not been called. She was still in her dormitory, along with perhaps 50 other women scattered throughout the harem whose names had been spared. Han didn't understand why. She didn't know what criteria had been used to select the others. Lady Kui wasn't there either. She had left the palace 3 days earlier with special permission to visit an ailing relative. Pure luck, pure random chance. Han stood at her window, looking out at the courtyard below. She could see a mass of women in the distance, their colored robes making a patchwork of reds and blues and grays. She could hear their voices, a low murmur of fear. And then the screaming started. It was 6 in the evening when the executions began. The method was lingqi, death by 1,000 cuts, an ancient form of execution designed to maximize suffering to make death slow and agonizing. The executioners had been given specific instructions. Make it last. From her window, Han couldn't see what was happening, but she could hear it. The screams started low and rose to shrieks. They came in waves, overlapping, one voice cutting off as another began. Sometimes the screaming would pause, and in that silence, Han could hear sobbing, begging prayers. Then it would start again. Han stood frozen at the window. She wanted to look away, to cover her ears to hide, but she couldn't move. Something in her had locked in place. She could only stand and listen. One of the palace physicians, an older woman who had been ordered to attend to any concubines who fainted or became ill during the waiting, came to check on Han. The physician's hands were shaking. Her face was gray. She looked at Han and said, "Close the shutters. Don't listen. Please." But Han didn't close the shutters. She stood there all night. The screaming went on for hours. Some of the victims died quickly within an hour. Others lasted much longer. 3 hours, 4. One woman's voice, thin and high, continued until nearly midnight. Han recognized some of the voices. Lady Zhou, who had tried to poison her. Zhou was 19 years old. She screamed for her mother. She screamed that she didn't know anything, that she was innocent, that this was a mistake. Her voice broke around 9 in the evening. After that, it was just wet, gasping sounds. Consort Mei, who had caused Yang to miscarry, was there too. Mei was 30 years old. She had spent 12 years in the Forbidden City. She made no sound at all. Not a scream, not a plea. The executioners had to work on her for 2 hours before she finally died, silent to the end. There was a girl, Han didn't know her name, who couldn't have been older than 14. She had only been in the palace for 2 months. She screamed "Mama" over and over until her voice gave out. Then she just whimpered, a sound like a wounded animal, until that too stopped. Pregnant women were not spared. Han heard one woman pleading, saying she was carrying the emperor's child, begging them to wait until the baby was born. They didn't wait. As midnight approached, the screaming began to fade. One by one, the voices went silent. By 1 in the morning, there was only the sound of boots on stone, eunuchs and servants moving through the courtyards, the rasp of carts being wheeled. Han finally moved from the window. She sat on her sleeping platform and stared at the wall. Her mind was very quiet. She couldn't think, couldn't process what she had just witnessed. At dawn, she heard water, lots of it. The servants were washing the courtyards. They carried buckets from the palace wells and poured them over the stones, scrubbing with brushes. It took hours. Even after the sun was fully up, they were still washing. When they were finished, Han could see the courtyard from her window. The stones were clean, perfectly clean, as if nothing had happened. But the wells they had used for the washing, those wells would become something else in the years to come. Those wells would become the place where concubines drowned themselves, where women chose to die rather than continue living in a palace soaked in blood. Lady Kui returned 2 days later. She came back to a harem of ghosts. Where there had been 3,000 women, now there were barely 200. The dormitories were empty. The courtyards were silent. Kui found Han in her room. Han was sitting in the same position she'd been in for 2 days, staring at the wall, not speaking, barely moving. Kui sat beside her. For a long time, neither of them said anything. Then Kui took Han's hand. "I know," she whispered. "I know what you heard." Han turned to look at her. Kui's face was wet with tears. "I'm going to tell someone," Kui said. "I'm going to make sure someone knows what happened here. I promise you. The world will know." Han's voice, when she finally spoke, was barely audible. "Why am I alive?" Kui had no answer. The official record of that night doesn't exist. The Ming court historians were ordered to omit any mention of it. Any document that referenced the purge was destroyed. Any servant or official who spoke of it was executed. But Lady Kui kept her promise. 18 years later, when a Korean diplomatic envoy visited the Forbidden City, she requested a private audience. She told him everything, every detail she could remember, the names of women she had known, the sounds Han had described to her, the buckets of water washing blood from the courtyards. The envoy recorded it all. He smuggled the documents back to Korea, where they were filed in diplomatic archives beyond the reach of Ming censors. That record still exists. It's housed in the National Archives of Korea, written in a mixture of Chinese and Korean characters. Historians didn't discover it until 1982. In that document, Lady Kui wrote, "On this night, 2,800 women were slaughtered like animals. Their crime was existing near a rumor. Their punishment was erasure from history. I am writing this so that someone someday will know they lived, will know their names, will remember." She listed as many names as she could recall, 47 in total. Most of the dead were never recorded anywhere else. Kui's document is the only proof they existed. Among those names was girl from Joseon, age 14, in palace 2 months. Kui didn't know her name, but she remembered the girl's voice screaming for her mother. The purge accomplished its goal. The rumor about the emperor's impotence stopped. No one dared speak of it again. No one dared speak of anything. The survivors learned to exist in absolute silence. Some lost their minds. Han would see them sometimes, women who would stand in corners talking to people who weren't there, or who would laugh suddenly for no reason, high brittle laughter that made everyone else look away. The palace physician told Han these women had experienced something their minds couldn't process. So their minds had broken. It was a mercy in a way. They no longer had to be present for what was happening to them. Han understood the appeal of that, of being able to leave your mind behind. 6 months after the purge, new concubines began arriving. Young girls 13 and 14 years old brought in to replace the dead. They had no idea what had happened. The surviving women were forbidden to tell them. Han watched these new girls arrive with their frightened eyes and their hope that maybe if they were good enough, if they were beautiful enough, they could have a decent life here. She wanted to warn them. She wanted to tell them to run, to resist, to choose death over this. But she said nothing. Because what would be the point? They were here now. The gates had closed behind them, and resistance only led to crushed hands and corpses by the roadside. The system continued, as if nothing had happened, as if 2,800 women hadn't been slaughtered in a single night. Emperor Yongle resumed his normal schedule. He summoned concubines, he held court, he commissioned new buildings. History would remember him as a great emperor, a visionary leader. The Forbidden City was his masterpiece, a monument to imperial power and Chinese civilization. No one would remember the blood. Han was 19 now. She had aged years and months. When she looked at herself in the polished bronze mirrors, she saw a stranger. Her face was thin, her eyes hollow. She looked like Lady Kui, like a ghost. She made a private vow to herself. She would survive, not because she wanted to, not because life was precious or beautiful or worth living, but because Lady Kui had asked her to, because someone needed to witness, someone needed to remember. If Han died, who would know what had happened to the girl with the crushed hand? Who would remember Sujin beaten and vanished? Who would remember the 14-year-old screaming for her mama? So Han kept living. She ate her small portions of food. She bowed when required. She kept her eyes down and her voice quiet. She took her contraceptive herbs, and she waited. For 3 more years she waited. In August of 1424, Emperor Yongle fell ill. He was 64 years old. He had been emperor for 22 years. The illness came suddenly. One day he was holding court. The next day he was bedridden, burning with fever. The imperial physicians did what they could, but Yongle was old, and the illness was aggressive. Within a week, it was clear he would not recover. The palace went into preparation mode. Protocols for imperial succession were activated. Yongle's son was summoned from his provincial governorship. Ministers began drafting transition documents. And in the harem, the women waited to learn their fate. 3 days before Yongle died, he gave an order. All concubines were to assemble outside his chambers. Over 180 women knelt in the corridors, some for hours, while the emperor lay dying inside. Many of the women fainted. The stone floor was hard and cold. They weren't permitted to move or speak. They could only kneel and wait. On the 4th day in the early morning, Emperor Yongle died. The announcement was made by the chief eunuch. The emperor had joined his ancestors. The Son of Heaven had ascended. The women were dismissed back to their quarters. They had no idea what would happen next. Han knew. Lady Kui had told her about the old traditions, the ones that supposedly no longer existed. But Kui had warned her. Sometimes the old ways returned. 2 days after Yongle's death, the eunuchs came with a list, 16 names. Among them, Joseon tribute number 7, Han. The practice was called shunzong, accompanying sacrifice. When an emperor died, certain concubines were selected to be buried with him. The official reasoning was that the emperor would need companions in the afterlife, women to serve him even in death. The selection criteria were precise. The women had to be those the emperor had favored, those he had summoned multiple times. But they couldn't have living sons. Sons provided protection. Sons meant the mother was valuable for dynastic reasons. Han had been summoned 3 times during her years in the palace. She had no children. She was 19 years old. She qualified perfectly. Lady Kui did not. At 27 years old and 5th rank with certain political connections, she was exempted. When Kui heard Han's name on the list, she ran to Han's dormitory. She found Han sitting calmly on her sleeping platform. "No," Kui said. "No, I'll petition the Empress. I'll find a way." Han looked at her with empty eyes. "There is no way. You know that. I won't let you die." "I've been dead since 1421, Han said. "Since the night I heard them screaming. Maybe before that. Maybe I died on the road from Korea. This is just making it official." Kui grabbed her hands. "Don't say that. Don't." "You told me to survive," Han said. "I did. For 3 years I survived. That's more than most. I kept my promise." "What promise?" "The one I made to my mother. I told her I would live. I did. I'm just tired now." The 16 selected women were moved to a separate wing of the palace. They were given 3 days. 3 days before the emperor's burial, before their own deaths. The treatment of these 3 days was grotesque in its false kindness. The women were served elaborate meals, delicacies they had never been permitted to taste. Roasted duck, sweet pastries, expensive wines. It was a feast for the condemned. Musicians played in the courtyard outside their quarters. Happy, celebratory music, as if this were a wedding, not an execution. On the first day, Han barely touched the food. She sat in her room and tried to remember her mother's face. She could almost see it, the shape of her eyes, the way she smiled. But the details were fuzzy, like looking through dirty glass. On the second day, Lady Kui was permitted to visit. She brought nothing but herself. She sat with Han for an hour. They didn't speak much. There was nothing left to say. Finally, as Kui was leaving, Han said, "Will you do something for me? Anything. Live a long time, and tell someone what happened here. Tell someone about all of us. Not just me, all of them. The 2,800. The girl who screamed for her mother. The woman with the crushed hand. All of them." Kui's voice broke. "I will. I swear it. Then I can rest." On the 3rd day, Han asked permission to write a letter to her mother. The request was granted. Women being sent to accompany the emperor were allowed this small dignity. A eunuch brought her paper and ink. Han wrote in Korean, knowing the eunuchs couldn't read it. The letter said, "Mother, I am writing to say I tried to keep my promise. You told me I had to live. I did. I lived for 8 years in a place where most people don't survive 8 weeks. I don't know if that makes me strong or just stubborn. I want you to know I thought of you every day. I remembered the indigo dye on your hands. I remembered your voice singing the old songs. I remembered the smell of the ocean. I hope my little brother grew up well. I hope father is still fishing. I hope Jin Woo found a nice girl to marry. I asked if I could come home to see you one more time. They said no, I belong to the emperor even now, even in death. But I want you to know I'm not afraid. I'm just tired. And soon I'll be free. Please don't mourn me. I stopped being your daughter a long time ago. Mourn the girl I was if you need to mourn someone. But know that she died happy in a village by the sea before any of this happened. The woman I became, she's ready to rest now, your daughter Han." She folded the letter and gave it to the eunuch. He promised it would be delivered to Korea. Han knew he was lying. The letter would be burned like her mother's hair, like everything else from her past. But Lady Kui was there. Kui had read the letter over Han's shoulder, and Kui had a gift that would prove invaluable, a perfect memory. Years later, when Kui recited that letter to the Korean envoy, she remembered every word. On the afternoon of the third day, the 16 women were led to the execution hall. It was a long, austere building in the northern section of the palace. Inside were 16 small rooms, each containing a single piece of furniture, a wooden beam across the ceiling, and hanging from it a white silk cord. The chief eunuch explained their options. They could choose to die honorably by their own hand. If they did this, their families would receive financial compensation and official recognition. The woman's death would be recorded as a noble sacrifice. Or they could refuse, in which case the eunuchs would hang them by force or administer drugs to render them unconscious before burial. It was a choice, but like every choice in the Forbidden City, it was an illusion. Both paths led to the same destination. Most of the women chose the silk. It was faster, cleaner, and their families needed the money. Han looked at the white cord hanging from the ceiling of her small room. She thought about the girl on the road from Korea, the one with the crushed hand. She thought about the 14-year-old screaming in the courtyard. She thought about Lady Zhou and Consort Mei and all the others who had died in blood and agony. At least she could choose this. The manner of her death, if not the fact of it. That was something. That was the last freedom she had. She placed the silk cord around her neck. She had watched other women go before her. She knew how to do it quickly. Her last thought was of her mother, not the memory of her mother, which had faded to almost nothing, but the feeling of her, the warmth, the safety. And then Han, who had been Joseon tribute number 7, who had been a fisherman's daughter, who had been 16 years old with indigo-stained hands and a whole life ahead of her, closed her eyes and stepped forward. The accounts say it was quick. 13 of the 16 women died within minutes. Their bodies were arranged in seated positions, dressed in their finest robes and placed in small chambers around the perimeter of Emperor Yonglei's main tomb. 3 of the women had refused the silk. They had struggled. The eunuchs had drugged them with opium, but not enough. When the tomb was sealed, those 3 were still breathing. The chambers were small, stone walls, stone ceiling, no windows, no light. The archaeological team in 1958 found those 3 skeletons surrounded by evidence of their final moments. Broken fingernails embedded in the stone walls, scratch marks, fractured hand bones from clawing at the sealed entrance. They had woken up in the dark, and they had tried to escape. The forensic report noted that based on the depth of the scratches and the patterns of bone damage, the women had survived for possibly several hours after being sealed in. Then they had suffocated, or died of dehydration, or simply given up. The chamber marked as number 7 contained a single skeleton, female approximately 19 years old. The hyoid bone showed clean fracture consistent with hanging. Death would have been relatively quick. No name was recorded on the chamber plaque, just a designation. Joseon Tribute, rank 7. If not for Lady Kwa's testimony preserved in Korean archives, no one would have ever known that the girl in Chamber 7 was named Han. Lady Kui lived for 20 more years after Han's death. She navigated the changing politics of the court. She survived the transition to the new emperor. She rose eventually to 3rd rank, a position of relative safety. But she never forgot what she had promised. In 1439, 15 years after Han's death, a Korean diplomatic envoy visited the Forbidden City. His name was Park Seo-jin, and he was there to negotiate trade agreements. Lady Kui, now 45 years old, requested a private audience. This was unusual but not forbidden. She was high enough rank to make such requests. They met in a small pavilion in the Eastern Gardens. Kui had brought tea. They observed the formalities, discussing weather and poetry and all the meaningless pleasantries expected of such meetings. Then Kui said, "I need you to write something down, and I need you to take it back to Korea. Can you do that?" Park Seo-jin looked at her carefully. "That would depend on what you want me to write." "The truth," Kui said, "a truth that the Ming court has buried, a truth that needs to be remembered." And then she told him everything. She told him about the tribute system, about the Korean women brought to the Forbidden City as gifts. She told him about the refinement process, the systematic destruction of identity and will. She told him about the invisible war, about the poisonings and the betrayals and the casual cruelty that permeated every moment of harem life. She told him about the night in 1421 when 2,800 women were executed. She named the ones she remembered. She described the sounds that had lasted until dawn. She told him about Shunzang, about the 16 women buried alive or hanged to accompany the emperor. And she told him about Han, about a 16-year-old girl from a fishing village who had survived 8 years in hell, who had kept her humanity when the system tried to erase it, who had chosen her death when she had no other choices left. Kui recited Han's final letter from memory. Every word exactly as Han had written it. Park Seo-jin wrote it all down. His hands shook as he wrote. When Kui finished speaking, there were tears on his face. "Why are you telling me this?" he asked. "Because someone needs to know," Kui said. "Because if no one remembers, it's like they never existed." And they did exist. They were real. They mattered. The Ming court will deny all of this. I know. That's why I'm telling you. So there's a record somewhere they can't reach. Park smuggled the documents back to Korea. They were filed in the diplomatic archives marked as sensitive intelligence. For centuries, they remained there unread, by most unknown to the wider world. Lady Kui died 5 years later in 1444 at the age of 50. Her last recorded words spoken to a servant who had been with her for many years were these: "I kept my promise. They will be remembered." The practice of Shunzang was officially abolished in 1464, 40 years after Han's death. The reason wasn't mercy or moral progress. It was political pressure. The families of sacrificed women had begun to cause problems for the court. There had been several attempted rebellions by officials whose daughters had been buried alive. The new emperor decided the practice caused more trouble than it was worth. But abolishing the sacrifice didn't free the concubines, it just changed their prison. Women who outlived their emperor were now sent to a place called the Palace of Perpetual Solitude. It was located in the farthest, coldest corner of the Forbidden City. The women sent there lived under strict rules. Never leave the palace grounds, never marry, never have contact with the outside world, perform manual labor, pray for the deceased emperor 3 times per day. Some of these women were 14, 15 years old, married to elderly emperors for a few months before the men died. They would spend the next 50, 60 years in the Palace of Perpetual Solitude. The youngest recorded widow was a girl named Chen Li. She was 14 when she married Emperor Jijing. He died 3 months later. Chen Li spent the next 61 years in isolation. She died at 75, having spent her entire adult life mourning a man she had barely known. The most common form of death in the Palace of Perpetual Solitude was drowning. The palace had several wells in the gardens. Every year, women would throw themselves into those wells. During the 18th century, palace records show an average of 12 bodies pulled from the wells per year. The guards would remove them at night. There were no funerals, no markers, just one less number in the ledgers. The system continued with minor modifications for another 400 years. The last imperial concubine of China was a woman named Wan Rong. She was the final empress, married to Puyi, the last emperor. When the dynasty fell in 1912, she was 17 years old. She spent the next 34 years navigating the chaos of early 20th century China, the fall of the empire, the warlord period, the Japanese invasion, the Civil War. By 1946, she was imprisoned by communist forces. She had lost all of her children. She was addicted to opium. Her mind had deteriorated from years of trauma and substance abuse. She died in that prison at 39 years old. There was no funeral, no memorial. Her body was buried in an unmarked mass grave alongside common criminals and war casualties. The 2,000-year-old institution of imperial concubinage ended, not with a grand abolition or moral awakening, but with a broken woman dying alone in a prison cell. Today, 14 million tourists visit the Forbidden City every year. They walk through the golden courtyards. They admire the architectural genius of the layout. They take photographs of the red walls and the sweeping roofs. Tour guides speak of the glorious history of imperial China. They mention the concubine system, but only in passing, usually with phrases like, "The emperor's many wives lived in luxury." They don't mention the tribute system that harvested women like crops. They don't mention the refinement process that broke their minds. They don't mention the invisible war, the poisonings, the vanishings. They definitely don't mention the night in 1421 when 2,800 women were executed. That's not in any official Chinese history. Most tour guides don't even know it happened. They don't mention the wells where women drowned themselves. They don't mention the palace of perpetual solitude. They don't mention the children torn from their mother's arms. And they don't mention the tomb of Emperor Yongle, located just north of the Forbidden City, where 16 women are still buried in chambers around the perimeter. If you visit that tomb, you can see small plaques marking the chambers. Most just say Imperial Consort or Palace Lady. No names, no details. Chamber 7 has a plaque that reads in Chinese characters, Joseon Tribute Rank 7. No name, no age, no story. But because of Lady Kuai, because of her promise and her perfect memory, because of Park Seo-jin's courage in recording what he was told, we know her name. Han, daughter of the Park family, from a fishing village on the southern coast of Korea. 16 years old when they took her, 19 when they buried her. She chose her death when she had no other choices. That deserves to be remembered. In 2019, a group of Korean and Chinese historians petitioned to have a memorial plaque placed at Yongle's tomb, listing the names of the known Korean tribute women. The Chinese government denied the petition. The official reason given was that it would be historically inappropriate. The unofficial reason was simpler. Acknowledging what happened would require admitting that one of China's great emperors was responsible for one of the largest mass executions of women in recorded history. It would require confronting uncomfortable truths about the systems of power that built the Forbidden City. It's easier to say nothing, to let the tourists take their photographs and leave believing in the romance of imperial China. But the truth has a way of surviving even when systems try to bury it. Lady Kui's testimony exists. Park Seo-jin's documents exist. The archaeological evidence from 1958 exists. The scratches on the walls of Chamber 3 exist. And now you know. You know about Han. You know about the 2,800. You know about the wells and the Palace of Perpetual Solitude and the Night of Blood that was erased from official history. You know what the Forbidden City was built on. The question is, what do you do with that knowledge? Because this isn't just ancient history. This isn't just a story about things that happened 600 years ago in a place far away. Systems of dehumanization didn't end in 1424. They didn't end in 1946 when Wanrong died in that prison. They evolved. They found new forms, new justifications. Right now, somewhere in the world, there are systems operating that treat human beings as property, that erase identities, that separate children from parents, that make people disappear into administrative categories and bureaucratic procedures. Immigration detention centers where people are held indefinitely without trial. Trafficking networks that move women and children like commodities. Prison systems that treat inmates as numbers, not people. Factories where workers live in dormitories. They can't leave working hours. They can't refuse for wages they can't survive on. The specifics change. The technology updates. The language becomes more sanitized. But the fundamental logic remains the same. Some people are valuable. Some people are useful. And some people are just inventory. The Forbidden City stands as a monument to imperial power and architectural achievement. 14 million people visit it every year and see beauty. But beneath that beauty is a foundation of bones. Women's bones, children's bones, the bones of people who were systemically dehumanized and abused and erased. And the same could be said for much of what we call civilization. Beneath the beauty, beneath the achievement, beneath the progress, there are always bones. The question we have to ask ourselves is this. When we walk over those bones, when we admire the buildings constructed on mass graves, when we celebrate systems built on the suffering of the powerless, what does that say about us? Are we any different from the Ming court historians who erased the purge from official records? Are we any different from the tour guides who speak of luxury and ignore the bodies in the wells? Or are we willing to stop, to look, to remember, to say their names: Han, Su-jin, the girl with the crushed hand, the 14-year-old who screamed for her mother, the 2,800 whose names Lady Kuei tried desperately to preserve. They existed, they suffered, they died, and they deserve to be remembered. Not as statistics, not as historical footnotes, but as human beings who were destroyed by a system that treated them as objects. Remembering is not enough. But it's a start, because the first step in dismantling a system of dehumanization is refusing to let it erase its victims. The first step is saying, I see you. I know what was done to you, and I will not forget. Han's mother never received that final letter. She never knew what happened to her daughter. She probably spent the rest of her life wondering if Han was alive, if she was happy, if she ever thought about home. We can't give her those answers. We can't undo what was done. But we can do this. We can remember. We can tell the story. We can refuse to let Han disappear into the silence that the Forbidden City was built to enforce. In Chamber 7 of Emperor Yonggolo's tomb, there is a skeleton, 19 years old, female. Evidence of hanging. No name on the plaque. But we know her name. Thanks to Lady Kwai, thanks to Park Seo-jin, thanks to the archivists who preserved documents that powerful people wanted destroyed, we know. Her name was Han. She was 16 years old when they took her from her village. She survived 8 years in a system designed to break her. She chose her death when she had no other choices left. And she will be remembered. Not by the Forbidden City, not by the tour guides, not by the official histories, but by us. By anyone who hears this story and refuses to forget. That's all she asked for. In her letter to her mother, in her final words to Lady Kwai, all she wanted was to be remembered as a person, not a number, not a tribute, not a possession. A person. So remember her, remember all of them. And the next time you see beauty built on bones, the next time you see a system that treats people as inventory, the next time you see power trying to erase the evidence of its crimes, remember what happened in the Forbidden City. Remember that silence is complicity. Remember that forgetting is a choice. And choose differently. Choose to see. Choose to remember. Choose to say their name. Han's name was Han. And she mattered. They all mattered. Remember,